So with no further ado, Koi, what is it good for? With the subtitle of Make Koi Not War, which hopefully will become apparent because I hate running gags that nobody gets because they're not of my generation. But anyway, in 1970, Edwin Starr asked the following question: War, what is it good for? And over the course of the next 3 minutes, he developed his answer: absolutely nothing. So today I'm going to ask a parallel question: Koi, what is it good for? And over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, I hope to develop the opposite answer. And in this way, I hope to convince you all to make Koi, not war. So what is Koi? These are the diagrams that Luke put together. I think his most recent endeavor. And what I'm going to show is like the adaptation of this. So we have a Koi node, which is defined within the CoiNet protocol, available on GitHub, which specifies that a Koi node has this kind of shape. It's a block with ports and terminals, and within the block, there is some process. It's just pretty generically defined at this point. There's the ability to compute, and there's some cache to keep track of what you've been computing. And then there's a communication protocol that allows Koi nodes to talk to one another. There's a push protocol that's event-driven. You can subscribe, essentially a pub sub. You can subscribe to other nodes and listen to events that they generate, and you can broadcast your own events. And in Koi node, the events are fun events. So forget, update, and new. And what they are in regards to are reference IDs, RIDs. So references to some object. And since this is knowledge organization infrastructure, the objects that we're talking about are knowledge objects. So we have these references to knowledge objects. We can listen to other Koi nodes sending events about what they have newly learned, what they have changed about what they've learned, or how their learnings have affected what they know, change updates. And a special case of updates is forget. We no longer care about this thing and we're not going to talk about it anymore. So again, listen, do some kind of computation with caching of what you know, and then broadcast changes to your sort of cache of what's relevant. And then in the red here below is if you don't want to do event-driven programming, there's a way to do pull, so you can request information about events from another node, and you can respond to other nodes' requests and send them what they want. I'm not going to go into this bottom piece because it's not really relevant to what I'm going to talk about. But using Koi node, you can then create these networks of Koi nodes where we can use some nodes to sense from outside of some boundary. You can have maybe some kind of coordinator that helps all the nodes within these boundaries get along. You can have specific processors to make sense of, for instance, anything that these sensory nodes have brought in. And then you have activators that can inject into the space outside of this network what it's learned. So that's where this talk's going to come from. So given that the context that I'm going to be talking to about is knowledge processing systems sit here in the middle of a digital distributed decision-making system, where we have sensors out here in the environment. We have direct processing of that sensory information, taking the noise out and leaving the good stuff in. And then based on that sort of informational view, putting things together into more abstract, more general knowledge objects based on those sort of general sense of what's going on in the world. You can then apply some context that you want to make a decision in, and then come to some understanding as to what that decision should be, and based on that decision, act, which then will affect the environment, which then should be picked up by these sensors, and you've got a nice little control loop. So in this, a coin node, this is my call to the block diagram protocol. Nothing we do at BlockScience is really different than anything else we do at BlockScience. It can all be expressed as a block diagram. So here, the coin node is basically responsible for observing an observed space. So points from this observed space come into the node. Based on what it knows and its sort of computational ability, it can crunch those incoming observed sensations and then produce some conceptual idea of what's going on out here. So that's the simplest thing that we're doing. But given this diagram, there's not much going on. So what BlockScience thinks of, is there anything else in the world like a coin node? And maybe I'm biased because of my background, but it seems to me that they're doing about the same thing that neurons are doing. That the neuron is sensing what's going on in its environment, aggregating that stuff up, trying to make sense of it, and then sending a message out based on what it thinks the sense of its inputs are to other systems for further processing. So here we go. So this is beginning to answer what is a CoinNet good for. So the simplest thing we could do is very similar to the simplest thing you can do with neurons. You can create a reflex. So here we have a sensor observing the observed space, processing it, sending what it's come up with to some actuator, which then affects this conceived space. And this is exactly what happens in, say, the patellar tendon reflex. This sensor here would be the spindle fibers in your patellar tendon. You hit it with a hammer. That fact is sent up to your spinal cord, where it's passed on to motor neurons, which then cause muscles to contract and your leg to kick. So this is just a standard reflex. Fun, but not particularly useful, unless you're a doctor. But we can do more. This is basically a modular architecture. We can just, if we want to do more complicated things, we can add more modules. So rather than having one sensor and one actuator, let's see if we can do sensor fusion. We can take the inputs of many sensors, all observing this observed space with different perspectives. It could be you've got two eyes looking at collecting visual information from two different angles, or it could be more diverse than that. You've got eyes, ears, and a nose. So you have different sensory modalities, all making sense of what's out here, getting correlated into some view of this observed space. We are getting more and more conceptual as we go here. And then based on this sort of higher level idea of what's going on in this observed space, we can create a much more refined action that we want to do other than just kicking your leg, and inject that out into the conceived space. So this is my model of what sensation looks like in a digital system. Now, so we have sensation. The next obvious step, if you've taken psychology courses, is to define what perception looks like. So to me, perception is, we're expanding this to whole sets of sensor information. So here we have sensory systems, essentially. And this could be vision, this could be some kind of proprioception, this could be audition. All of these systems coming together to identify objects in an otherwise undifferentiated observed space. And then based on that analysis of this observed space, we can then activate a whole sort of coordinated set of actuators and perform some rather complicated behaviors based on our perceived notion of what's going on in the world. So this then perception and the idea of coordination. And then, as any good psychologist knows, after perception, you got to deal with cognition. And I'm not even going there yet because we're still here, essentially. What we want to develop is this sensation system where we have our sensors looking at, say, a Google Drive. We have a sensor looking at HackMDs. We have a sensor looking at Slack. And based on all of these inputs, we process them through embedding, we embed them into a semantic vector space and let an LLM have at them and produce sensible outputs based on these inputs. So that this is our current sort of what we want to do lives in this space. So I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves in worrying about what cognition looks like. There are people in the room here who have ideas of what this looks like. Maybe they want to discuss it at some point, but well, I'll leave it here. So again, I want to leave you with make COI not war, and you might end up with understanding rather than just a big mess. And thanks y'all for listening to me. And special thanks to the group that's been working on this. Call out Orion, Luke, Jeff, Joshua, and Sarah for doing stuff while I doodle on diagrams. Thank you. Any questions?
I'll take the bait on the cognition thing. So David knows that my current take on this is that an organization such as BlockScience is already a cognitive system. We have the capacity for group level sense making in keeping with the kind of diverse minds Michael Levin approach to thinking about what might be a cognitive system. Would argue that in a sense, BlockScience as a group already exhibits properties of a cognitive system, and that actually what we're doing right now is closer to metacognition. We're thinking about how we think about things and altering the way that we structure our information. And so I would hazard to say that this diagram goes beyond perception to cognition already if you start making explicit the interfaces to the humans that are in some sense perpendicular to this. So some of these sensors and processors and actuators have, let's say, like interfaces in a perpendicular plane where we're reading to and writing from them, or we could make more explicit the fact that's what the sensors and actuators are doing. They're reading from stuff we're doing and writing to the workspaces that we're in. That shows up in Slack with the LLM, but might show up more realistically through things like authoring Google Docs and HackMDs, where to David's other diagrams about knowledge processing, there's a very strong loop closure between our individual and group level knowledge object production and our individual and group level knowledge object consumption, which closes a feedback loop, which produces a set of behaviors that go beyond just perception and coordination, but arguably would pass some definitions of cognition. David and I talked a little bit about this idea of entropy and a system with a dotted line around it having the property that the entropy in like kind of the information theoretic sense, in the sense of the variety it can exhibit, even the variety it exhibits being smaller at the group level than the sum of the absolute variety of the subsystems, because that implies that those subsystems are like co-regulating or self-regulating in some sense. And so just starting to ask questions about closing loops and co-regulation and the interfaces between these systems and humans, I think you start to get things that look and feel like, again, depending on your choice of definition, cognitive systems already, and that what we're doing is closer to metacognition at the group level, because we're cognating about how we cognate and even reconfiguring that in an intentional way. Obviously, lot TBD. I do like the to-do node, but I think there's at least a conceived space around cognition and metacognition here that in some ways is the very purpose of COI. It's to ask, how are we doing group level cognition, and are we okay with it? To borrow from David again, is it wise, not just intelligent? And for that, you have to be able to metacognate. And so coming from the other direction would be to say, our organization is already a cognitive system as a group, and that when we metacognate, we ask questions and think about how we think, and then we find ourselves being like, maybe we could rearrange that. And so we're in fact moving in the other direction, creating systems that can facilitate group level, like improving or adjusting or restructuring our group level cognitive feedback processes.
I was really intrigued by the idea of the reflex as something recognizable in an evolved system rather than a designed system. The fact that there's a clear pattern here that you could search for in a, okay, maybe you're generating augmented graphs and you want to recognize when a reflex has occurred in response to something. I guess, do you have a sense of how to recognize a reflex in a system and how it would be differentiated from other types of things that could occur?
My definition is biological. It's simplicity. There's effectively nothing between the sensor and the actuator. In other systems, there could be degenerate pieces in between, but they don't really do anything. They're just pass-throughs. If you can identify something as a pass-through, eliminate it, filter it out of concern, and still see this sensor straight to actuator, then you've got basically a reflex. And what I mean by reflex is there's very little room for modification of the behavior. The only real thing that the patellar tendon reflex does is this actuator has effectively a threshold. And if the sensed output hits a certain level, it triggers the knee reflex. But that's the only processing that really goes on here. And thresholds are pretty simple. You don't need anything other than these two. The processing within the actuator is sufficient, or it could be within the sensor, but one or the other implements a threshold and passes it on.
Okay, a processor, this sort of inner dash central processing unit thing in the diagram, there could be cases in which it's processing based on conditions that it observes that is also conceived. For example, if an actuator produces knowledge objects that end up in conceived space, there could be a case in which it is noted that it has been produced by a system like this, and a scenario in which people will validate that information as being satisfactory in some sense. Is there a distinction like that considered, like the difference between what's conceived and observed and what makes observed valid to be sensed?
That the purpose of this is to try to make sense. So rather than validity, I'd use the words make sense. But I think the other thing is that you've indicated, and this diagram tries to show, is that the definitions of sensors, processors, and actuators are really slippery. I could consider this thing that I've labeled a processor a sensor if I only think about this box. The other thing to think about is that most of the lines in this diagram you should consider leaky. The borders I've drawn as dotted lines to make it explicitly leaky. These wires are also leaky, or you might not want to have any leakage and explicitly show feedback. But you can't really say just because this thing is embedded in something that it isn't in some way directly affected by what's going on out in the periphery. It can be insulated, but no insulation is perfect.
Okay, so it's designed as intended. Like the intention for that leftmost COI processor is up to the people who designated it as such in this diagram.
Yeah, well, the designation as a sensor is somebody made that designation. Somebody looked at this diagram tried to make sense of it, and in doing so, labeled this a sensor.
Yeah, like the other day,
It's about as practical as you get.
what inspired this question was Sayer describing a G drive sensor that was leveraging the Claude AI API, and it sent me for a bit of a loop because to me, my perspective of it was like this leftmost processor in the central dotted box. Like I just couldn't really, I couldn't place it on this diagram. This is the diagram that I have in my head. But when somebody else describes something as a sensor or an actuator, there are cases in which I don't know where to place it in the diagram. And is there some kind of goalpost that'll help a group place these blocks?
They're going to have to come up with their own sense-making standard, largely because this whole big complicated thing can be collapsed into that.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
any one of these nodes can have the complexity of this entire diagram. And this whole diagram can be represented with the simplicity of a single node.
Okay. I like this. Is good.
Just had it's a follow-on question actually to what Joshua was raising, which is within the context of being able to, let's say, differentiate between the different functions. I can think about this sort of as like a one type of coin node to rule them all is like a stem cell. And then you end up with kind of the way that the environment feeds back onto it, it starts to differentiate itself. To what extent is the ultimate game plan or goal when we start to leverage this in our work to have a broad tapestry of predefined coin nodes that we have to pick up and slot maybe in a visual medium to like figure out what connectors we need for our context for an LLM to do its work, versus having like archetypes that are very general. Like you were saying, you draw a box around and say, well, just pick a sensor type and it'll figure out what it needs to connect to, given all the possible things it can connect to. And then let it do its work by chewing on the context you feed it. And then gradually it will become either one of our stock types or will become something that is bespoke to your project or to your usage. Where do you see the end result going toward?
There is this idea that there is a sort of domain general architecture that one could use. The stereotypical, the prototypical standard example is something along the lines of a deep convoluted neural network. That there is effectively, it constitutes this random latent space that gets trained to do something. Now, people do that, but it takes 9 months for that stem cell to become something that's self-supporting. And it takes another 30 years for your brain to mature to the point where people are going to trust what you say. I think we can short circuit that process with a little bit of engineering. So each one of these nodes could be a deep convoluted neural network that has to learn. And as Sean has given us a tool for, we can create a network as complicated as we want and have it just make every possible connection. But then you need something along the lines of Hebbian learning to decide which connections are any good and which ones are not. And it's just a really inefficient process. So if you know ahead of time where you want to go, you might be able to shape more rapidly where you want to get to. And that's, we know that we want to have these standard pieces. It's our job right now to understand how to recognize them when we've created them. And
I think that's exactly the challenge. Yeah, because from my perspective, I can see like a catalog of sensors being readily apparent, but I can see a lot of gray area starting to come about where you're not entirely certain what processor you're supposed to be using and what kind you want perception, but what kind of perception isn't really defined until you've already delineated the kinds of sensors that are fusing. And you may not even necessarily know how to classify this like to use the diagram as an example, this triad goes with this particular process, or this triad goes with that one. And so I was wondering the extent to which there, as you said, like the limitations on like a back propagation updating or a Hebbian learning or something else that would work in that context.
So I want to do a concrete sanity check too, though. It's like, one is that we don't need these things to be super AI or learning heavy. In fact, once you're doing the architecture this way, you could have an entirely expert system, like a topology of expert systems with just rules. Like this could be viewed entirely like a data supply chain, like a bunch of kind of ingest and conform steps, and then some sort of expert system. I've been thinking a lot about this because I've been working on developing business around this knowledge and capability as algorithms as policy. And so I would use an example like Social Security Administration, which is, I'm like talking to some folks who are interested in bringing automation into at least a fast chain, quick approval process, where you have to take in a whole bunch of different multimodal information. You'll have basically sensor decoders. So if you think of like the clusters of sensors of being common type, maybe they're PDFs. And then you have sensor decoders that structure and organize that information, and then processes that take the structured and ordered information into a refinement, into something like estimating some facts, and then taking the fact estimates and applying some existing expert systems rules that are literally legislated and then ultimately rendered a decision. And then that whole system is fed back on by an oversight body that's measuring it against other metrics, which you could also think as images, as the same kind of drawing, to make it practical and pull it all the way down to stuff we're actually doing. At the narrowest scope, that's what the e-bike stuff is. It's just like, hey, like we are gonna prescribe specific sensors. Like we can configure our HackMD sensor, we can configure our GitHub sensor, we can configure our Google Drive sensor, and we can point it. So we can both configure it and point it at something. And then we can write a decoder one step down of it that is aware of what we pointed it at. And so I think some of the issue here is that in the generality, it's easy to talk about these stories, but in specificity, you're literally just creating a model the same way we do for our client models. We're literally just taking a bigger picture, observed space and conceived space, and saying we want to get from here to there. And then we're breaking down what that means and saying, okay, well, here isn't just one place. It's got all of these things that we can sense. Great. But now that we know that, we know something about what should be downstream of those things to make sense of them, to conform them, to integrate them. But in order to fill one of these in a non-abstract way, you really just need to start with an observed space and a conceived space and an animating purpose, and then start breaking it down until you can actually specify the blocks, which I think is something that we are now at the point where is exactly what we need to be doing in this research. And that's why, to our previous meetings, I'm like pretty excited to take a really minimalist kind of output template conceived space and input open-ended observed space, but just to constrain it to say things we can sense with something that can read PDFs, something that can read Google Docs, something that can read Markdown, something that can read a Git repo. And that's like enough. You just put the stuff you want to sense in the places the sensors are hooked. You prescribe something about what you're expecting to see, and then decode the sensor data and organize it. And then as you go through the process, you get to something that outputs in the conceived space. And then, of course, this goes back to the human kind of cyborgy bit. It's not good enough just because it transformed the data from the observed space into the conceived space. We have some validation, some sense of whether it did a good job, and some capacity for calibrating. And so to some extent, our feedback loop, our backprop, isn't algorithmic, it's human. It's us going back in and being like, oh yeah, this wasn't quite right. Let me tweak the rules in the processor that decodes the data that came from GitHub, give it a little bit more information about what to look for and how to parse it, or extend the question kit that we're using, or maybe shrink the question kit that we're using because one of the questions is just not giving, it's actually causing more noise than benefit. There's this like total coin flip where we've like got all of this theory and all of these tools, and it's like we're entering the phase where we turn it upside down and start just using it to do stuff in order to figure out what the node templates should be, how to make them more configurable, and how to like maintain this, or actually really not just to maintain, but to like actualize the research that we've done both on the systems design side with things like BDP and MSML and CAD to make sense of closed loop behavior of complex systems from a design and analysis standpoint, and what we've researched and how to implement them from a COI side. And now we have our opportunity to both design and implement and use closed loop knowledge processing systems.
And because these are expressible as block diagrams, we should be able to come up with a CAD representation of them that will allow us to rapidly explore that solution space. So
In other words, CAD can
all of these.
orchestrate this.